In the quiet years before the 20th century opened, the United States was a country still finding its balance between tradition and rapid change. Railways stretched across great distances, small towns expanded into cities, and questions of national direction rested heavily on public life. Into this landscape came the long, steady presence of Grover Cleveland, a figure remembered for restraint, careful judgment, and an unwavering sense of duty during a period of shifting political currents. His life unfolded across decades when the nation was learning to navigate industrial growth, social transformation, and the responsibilities of expanding governance. This documentary drifts gently through that era, tracing the path of one man's quiet progress from modest beginnings to the highest office in the country. As the story settles into its slow rhythm, listeners who feel at ease may choose to support the channel by liking the video, subscribing for future histories, or sharing where they are listening from, allowing this peaceful journey through the past to continue. With that calm foundation set, the narrative turns toward his earliest years, before public life, before reputation, and before the responsibilities that would later define him. The life of Grover Cleveland began in the small community of Caldwell, where quiet streets, simple homes, and the gentle rhythms of local parish life formed the backdrop to his earliest days. The year was 1837, a time when the United States remained a young nation, only 6 decades removed from its founding, and still marked by the steady expansion of frontier settlements and the measured development of its institutions. Caldwell itself reflected these characteristics. It was a town shaped by church gatherings, modest businesses, and the patterns of families who had lived in the region for generations. Stephen and Anne Cleveland, his parents, created a household guided by discipline, study, and a sense of moral steadiness. His father served as a Presbyterian minister, and the family frequently relocated as he accepted new assignments across the region. Each move introduced young Grover to different communities that all shared the common features of early 19th century American towns: wooden meeting houses, unpaved roads, and close connections among local residents. These settings left an impression not through grandeur, but through a consistent atmosphere of order and responsibility. The Cleveland family lived with modest means. Church service brought with it a respectability rooted in devotion, but did not provide material comfort. As a child, Grover learned the value of work through household expectations and the broader example of his parents, who devoted their efforts to others with quiet resolve. Books, sermons, and the structured routine of a minister's home created an environment in which education and self-restraint were quietly emphasized. Though he would not pursue a scholarly path, these early influences contributed to the steady temperament recognized in his later public career. The towns in which the family lived offered glimpses of a country on the threshold of transformation. Canals and turnpikes were gradually expanding transportation networks, and newspapers circulated discussions of national policy, economic uncertainty, and the widening differences between regions. Yet in the smaller communities of New York and New Jersey, where much of his childhood unfolded, these developments were felt gently, as distant movements rather than immediate forces. The pace of daily life remained slow, shaped more by seasonal cycles than political ones. When Grover was still young, the family settled for a time in Fayetteville, a village where he attended local schools and participated in chores expected of a minister's son. The structure of schoolhouses in that era emphasized recitation, memorization, and long hours of disciplined study. His performance was steady rather than exceptional, and marked by reliability rather than academic distinction. He developed a habit of persistence that would later guide him through more demanding environments. The family's financial limitations became more pronounced as the years progressed. His father's health weakened, and the responsibilities placed upon the older children increased. By adolescence, Grover understood that his future would require personal effort rather than inherited opportunity. This recognition did not create urgency so much as a quiet awareness that he would need to shape his own path when the time came. In 1853, the family faced a significant loss when his father died after a prolonged illness. Grover was 16, and the event brought an early sense of adult responsibility. The absence of the household's central figure reshaped family life and ended the pattern of frequent relocations tied to pastoral duty. His mother and siblings remained close, but the time had come for each child to consider independent prospects. The following years marked the transition from childhood into early adulthood. The young man who emerged from the small towns of New Jersey and upstate New York carried with him the quiet influence of his upbringing. A preference for routine, a respect for clear boundaries, and a steady composure shaped by the example of a family devoted to service. These formative experiences did not predict the prominence he would later achieve, yet they provided the firm internal foundation upon which the rest of his life would gradually be built. When he reached the age when many young men began to seek work, he stood at a threshold familiar to those of his time, one defined not by predetermined direction, but by the gradual unfolding of opportunity. Ahead lay new cities, new responsibilities, and a series of choices that would, over decades, guide him toward national leadership. But in these early years, his life remained rooted in the modest landscapes of the northeastern United States, still quiet, still unhurried, and shaped by the influences of family, faith, and the gentle pace of rural communities. The early household that shaped Grover Cleveland was one marked by steadiness, quiet expectation, and the modest circumstances common to many families of 19th century clergy. His parents, Stephen and Anne, maintained a home in which order and responsibility formed the fabric of daily life. As a Presbyterian minister, Stephen Cleveland held a position that was respected in the communities he served, yet it brought little financial security. The family's resources were limited, and their movements were guided not by personal ambition, but by pastoral assignments in various towns across New York and New Jersey. Each relocation drew the household into new congregations and new modest dwellings, leaving the children accustomed to adapting quietly to changing surroundings. Within this atmosphere, the values that shaped Grover's early character took root. His mother, a woman of gentle discipline and resilience, managed the practical affairs of the home with calm resolve. She oversaw the children's education, their chores, and their moral instruction, maintaining a sense of stability even when the family's circumstances shifted. Books held a central place in the household, not as luxuries, but as essential tools for study and reflection. Religious texts, sermons, and collections of moral essays filled the small bookcases, their presence shaping the rhythm of evenings and the tone of conversation. In this setting, learning was not loud or celebrated. It was quietly expected. The Cleveland children were raised with clear boundaries and few indulgences. Material possessions were modest, shared among siblings and carefully preserved. Clothing was plain, purchased sparingly and worn for many years. These conditions cultivated in Grover a temperament marked by caution with resources, a trait that would later appear in his public service. The habit of living within modest means was formed not through ideology, but through necessity, reinforced daily by the example of parents who accepted their circumstances without complaint. In the communities where the family lived, the minister's home often served as a point of quiet connection. Parishioners visited for counsel or simple conversation, and Grover observed the way his father received them, with patience, attentiveness, and a restrained manner that neither hurried nor imposed. These interactions introduced him to the responsibilities that accompany positions of trust. Though he did not aspire to follow the clerical path, The demeanour he witnessed influenced his understanding of leadership as something rooted in steadiness rather than display. Schooling during these years took place in small or orderly rooms where wooden desks faced instructors who emphasized memorization, recitation, and moral instruction. Grover's performance was dependable rather than exceptional. He absorbed lessons with persistence, but without marked enthusiasm for academic distinction. His teachers noted his reliability and seriousness, traits that accompanied him into adulthood. He did not seek praise or exhibit a desire for attention. Instead, he approached tasks with the plain diligence expected of him. Even as the family transitioned between towns, often in response to Stephen Cleveland's pastoral duties, its internal atmosphere remained consistent. Mornings began early, with routine household tasks. Afternoons were filled with schoolwork, errands, and the modest contributions each child made to the maintenance of the home. Visits to parish members, attendance at church gatherings, and participation in community events formed a gentle framework around the family's life. These experiences brought Grover into contact with people of varied backgrounds, though all existed within the shared culture of small-town America in the mid-19th century. Quiet streets, modest economies, and social networks built on long-standing familiarity. The Cleveland household also experienced an undercurrent of fragility, shaped by the financial strain that often accompanied pastoral work. Income from ministerial positions was modest, and the family sometimes relied on the generosity of congregations or careful management of resources to meet their needs. Children learned early that every expenditure required consideration. For Grover, this environment reinforced a cautious attitude toward financial matters, one that would later appear in his administrative decisions as he approached government expenditures with similar restraint. The influence of his father extended beyond household discipline. Stephen Cleveland, though often burdened with the responsibilities of ministry, embodied a thoughtful and principled approach to life. He delivered sermons with measured clarity, emphasizing moral consistency and personal responsibility. Grover absorbed these values not through formal instruction, but through observation. The calm authority with which his father conducted himself, both in the pulpit and at home, left a lasting impression on the young man's understanding of duty. The death of his father in 1853 marked a profound turning point. The household, already modest in its material means, and now faced the challenges of reorganizing life without its central figure. Grover, 16 years old at the time, experienced the shift in responsibilities that often accompanies such a loss. His mother, left to guide a large family through uncertain circumstances, maintained her quiet strength. Under her direction, the children adjusted to a life in which each contributed more fully to the household's well-being. In this period, a deeper seriousness began to settle over Grover. He grew more aware of the practical realities facing the family and the necessity of shaping a future through his own efforts. His early aspiration of attending college, an idea once entertained but never strongly pursued, became impractical given the family's financial condition. The thought of formal education receded, and replaced by the need to find work that would allow him to support himself and, at times, assist his family. Yet even as adulthood approached, the influences of his upbringing remained intact. The environment in which he had been raised had not encouraged ambition in the modern sense. Instead, it nurtured reliability, caution, and a respect for quiet competence. These traits, though subtle in youth, would later contribute to the public perception of him as a figure of integrity in an era when political life was often marked by competition and patronage. Through these early experiences, the foundation of Grover Cleveland's character was quietly established. It was formed not through dramatic events, but through the steady rhythms of family life, the example of principled parents, and the modest realities of small-town communities in New York and New Jersey. In these settings, he developed the reserved manner, the careful judgment, and the internal steadiness that would eventually guide him into roles far removed from the simple rooms and quiet streets of his youth. When he reached the age at which young men began to seek their own direction, he carried these influences with him, unassuming, quiet, and prepared to step gradually into a world that would reveal its opportunities one deliberate step at a time. As Grover Cleveland entered early adulthood, the realities of his family's modest circumstances guided his decisions more than personal ambition. The loss of his father had left the household in a position where each child was expected to contribute to its stability. Grover, practical and dutiful, he sought employment wherever opportunities appeared, first considering roles that were within reach for a young man without formal higher education. For a time, he assisted at the New York Institution for the Blind, where his older brother William served as teacher. The work was steady, and the environment was structured and purposeful. Yet Grover sensed that the role did not align with his developing interests. His temperament inclined toward quiet focus, but the duties of teaching did not inspire a long-term commitment. It was during this period that the possibility of travel westward emerged, a notion entertained by many young men of the era. The West held the promise of new settlements, expanding towns, and the chance to shape one's future through persistent effort. For Grover, the idea shifted towards something specific when an older relative, Lewis Allen, invited him to consider opportunities in Buffalo, where Allen was an established figure in the local community. The invitation did not guarantee employment, yet it offered a direction, a place where work might be found, and where a young man could build a life independent of the constraints that had shaped his early years. In 1855, carrying few possessions and even fewer expectations, Grover set out for Buffalo. The journey took him through regions shaped by the Erie Canal and the steady growth of commerce that followed its development. Towns along the route reflected a nation in transition, where older agricultural patterns coexisted with expanding industrial activity. By the time he reached Buffalo, he encountered a city quite different from the quiet villages of his childhood. Positioned at the western terminus of the canal and near the shores of Lake Erie, Buffalo had grown into a bustling center of trade, industry, and transport. Ships, warehouses, and rail connections created a sense of motion that contrasted sharply with the pastoral scenes of upstate communities he had known before. Despite its busyness, the city carried a sense of order that appealed to him. Streets followed a deliberate plan. Businesses operated with regularity, and institutions of law and public service supported a growing population. Grover found temporary residence with his relative's family, grateful for their hospitality while he sought steady employment. He approached the task without urgency, following his lifelong habit of deliberate persistence. Day by day he made inquiries, observed the rhythm of the city, and familiarized himself with its opportunities. His first reliable position came through his connection with Lewis Allen, who helped him secure work as a clerk with a local law firm. The role was modest in responsibility, yet it placed him in an environment that would quietly shape the course of his life. The office, filled with carefully arranged papers, legal documents, and steady discussion between attorneys, offered a structured world governed by precedent and procedure. Grover found that the discipline and routine of legal work suited him. Though he began with simple clerical duties, copying documents, organizing records, and assisting with correspondence, he gradually developed an understanding of the principles underlying the tasks he performed. Law, to him, represented a field defined by clarity, rules, and the careful weighing of facts. These qualities resonated with the values of his upbringing. Without formal legal training, He approached the subject through observation and study, often staying late to review volumes of case law and statutory texts. His dedication did not stem from a desire for prestige, but from a quiet satisfaction in mastering the work before him. The attorneys in the firm recognized his diligence and seriousness, offering guidance and encouraging his continued study. Buffalo, at this time, was a city shaped by workers, tradespeople, and the expanding professional class. Its growth created a demand for legal services, municipal organization, and civic leadership. As Grover adapted to life in this environment, he found that the city's pragmatism aligned with his own. He lived simply, spending long hours at work and reserving his leisure for reading or walking through the well-ordered streets that framed his new home. The decision to pursue formal admission to the bar emerged gradually. Initially, he viewed his position as a practical means of supporting himself, yet as he gained familiarity with the law and witnessed how attorneys guided disputes, structured agreements, and supported civic order, he saw a path that could offer steady employment and meaningful contribution. Under the mentorship of lawyers in the firm, he continued his studies with increasing focus, often reading late into the night by lamplight. These efforts, consistent but not hurried, led to his admission to the New York bar in 1859. With this achievement, Grover stepped into a new stage of his life. He began to practice independently, accepting clients who needed representation in civil matters, property disputes, and other common legal concerns of a growing city. His reputation developed slowly but firmly. Clients appreciated his straightforward manner, his careful preparation, and his refusal to make promises he could not keep. He did not rely on charm or dramatic courtroom presence. Instead, he cultivated trust through reliability and clarity. The modest success of his early legal practice enabled him to live comfortably but not extravagantly. He rented simple rooms, maintained a routine of long working days, and built relationships within Buffalo's legal and civic communities. His colleagues noted his seriousness and his deliberate way of approaching decisions. Although he did not seek attention, he gained respect for his integrity and diligence. Life in Buffalo provided him with a sense of stability and independence that had not been possible in his youth. The city, with its balanced combination of energy and structure, suited his temperament. Here, he found not only employment but also a sense of belonging in a community where steady work and dependable conduct were valued. By the early 1860s, the foundations of his adult life were firmly in place. He had established himself as an attorney, adapted to the rhythms of an expanding urban centre, and begun to form connections that would influence his future. Though he could not yet foresee the public responsibilities that lay ahead, the qualities that would define his later career, careful judgment, restraint, and a commitment to straightforward service, were already evident in the quiet, steady path he followed through the growing city of Buffalo. As Grover Cleveland settled more firmly into professional life, the discipline and steadiness that shaped his early years continued to guide his actions. His legal apprenticeship had introduced him to a world in which order arose from written statutes, measured argument, and the persistent effort of gathering facts. This environment suited him deeply. The law demanded patience, careful study, and a willingness to follow established principles rather than personal impulses. These qualities were woven into his character from childhood, allowing him to progress naturally through responsibilities that might have felt overwhelming to others. During his first years as a practicing attorney, he occupied modest offices and handled cases typical of a growing American city. Property disputes, contractual disagreements, and matters of local governance filled his days. The work required long periods of quiet preparation, reviewing documents and organizing arguments with deliberate care. He did not approach each case with dramatic flair. Instead, he relied on methodical analysis and a clear understanding of procedural rules. his colleagues came to recognize that though he seldom sought the spotlight, he could always be trusted to carry out his tasks with seriousness and precision. Buffalo itself was expanding rapidly. As new residents arrived and businesses multiplied, the need for legal order grew just as quickly. Courts heard disputes related to land development, commercial growth, and shifting municipal boundaries. These circumstances created a fertile setting for attorneys willing to work diligently, and Grover found no shortage of clients who valued his straightforward approach. He maintained reasonable fees and invested little in the social displays that often accompanied professional advancement. His plain lifestyle reflected both earlier influences and an instinctive preference for simplicity. It was during these years that he began to accept roles that connected him more directly to public institutions. His first significant appointment came when he was chosen to serve as Assistant District Attorney for Erie County. This position, though demanding, aligned well with his developing sense of civic responsibility. The role required him to prosecute cases on behalf of the state, apply statutory law with consistency, and maintain impartial judgment in matters affecting the welfare of the community. He approached these duties with the same quiet diligence that marked his work in private practice. Serving as an assistant district attorney broadened his understanding of public administration. He observed how courts, law enforcement, and municipal offices interacted to maintain order within a rapidly changing urban environment. The work demanded not only legal knowledge, but also a willingness to exercise discretion in decisions that affected individuals and families. Grover carried out his responsibilities with restraint, avoiding unnecessary displays of authority. Those who interacted with him noted a calm confidence, rooted not in personal ambition, but in his steady commitment to the tasks before him. During periods when he returned to private practice, he continued to build a reputation for fairness and clarity. He did not advertise aggressively or cultivate social circles to attract clients. Instead, he allowed his work to speak quietly for itself. His reliability and measured approach gradually led to positions of greater trust. Over time, local leaders began to view him as a figure capable of managing responsibilities that extended beyond the confines of individual legal cases. His involvement in civic affairs gradually increased. Buffalo, like many growing cities of the mid-19th century, required a dependable network of public servants to oversee debates about taxation, infrastructure, public safety, and the administration of justice. While many pursued such positions with enthusiasm, Grover often accepted roles only after being encouraged by colleagues who recognized his capability. He did not seek public attention, yet he understood that institutions relied on individuals willing to serve with integrity. The years of his early legal career also coincided with national events of deep consequence. The Civil War had altered the nation's social and political landscape, creating new challenges at both federal and local levels. Although Grover did not serve in the military, his responsibilities to his family and professional obligations influenced this decision. He experienced the effect of the war as many civilians did, through local enlistments, shifts in business, and the quiet anxieties expressed in correspondence and public gatherings. These events shaped the context in which his professional life developed, though he remained focused on the orderly responsibilities of his work rather than the larger political currents of the nation. As he gained experience, his colleagues increasingly viewed him as a person whose judgment could be trusted in difficult situations. He was deliberate in his reasoning and careful to avoid taking positions without full consideration of the facts. This approach gave him a reputation for independence, an independence rooted not in contrarian impulses, but in a deep respect for process and evidence. His decisions were shaped less by the pressures of public opinion and more by the internal compass established during his youth. The modest success of his legal practice provided him with financial stability and allowed him to participate more fully in the civic life of the city. He moved into comfortable but unadorned living quarters, maintained a simple routine, and continued his habit of devoting long hours to work. Social engagements were limited, though he formed steady friendships with colleagues who shared his preference for rational conversation and disciplined effort. Even in informal settings, he carried himself with quiet reserve, speaking thoughtfully and seldom rushing to judgment. By the late 1860s, his reputation had extended beyond legal circles into the broader community. Local leaders recognized in him a capacity for impartial decision-making, an essential trait in positions of public trust. When opportunities arose for appointments within county administration, his name frequently appeared among those considered. Though he didn't pursue these roles actively, he accepted them when called upon, viewing public service as a practical extension of his professional responsibilities rather than as a path to personal advancement. This period marked the gradual integration of Grover Cleveland into the structure of local governance. His early legal apprenticeship had introduced him to the letter of the law. His later roles invited him to administer it on behalf of the public. Through careful work in each position he held, he demonstrated a consistent pattern, a refusal to seek attention, a dedication to methodical preparation, and a firm commitment to carrying out duties with fairness. These years laid the groundwork for the leadership roles that would follow. His reputation grew not through dramatic accomplishments, but through the quiet accumulation of trust. Colleagues, citizens, and local officials increasingly viewed him as a dependable figure, someone who combined legal knowledge with principled conduct in a way that felt rare amid the shifting political dynamics of the era. As the city continued to expand and its public needs grew more complex, Grover Cleveland stood at the threshold of broader responsibilities. The habits formed during his legal apprenticeship, careful study, restraint, and a commitment to straightforward service, prepared him for the administrative challenges that soon awaited him. In time, these qualities would draw him more visibly into the realm of public office, where the quiet competence he cultivated in his early professional life would become the foundation of his growing influence. As the years of Grover Cleveland's legal work unfolded, his reputation for careful judgment and dependable service continued to attract the attention of those responsible for guiding the civic life of the growing city around him. Buffalo's expansion created an ongoing need for individuals who could manage public responsibilities with clarity, restraint, and a sense of fairness. Cleveland, who approached every task with quiet diligence, gradually became a figure upon whom local leaders felt they could rely. His rise through local offices did not occur through deliberate effort on his part. Rather, it emerged naturally from the steady manner in which he conducted his daily work. His earliest formal responsibilities in public administration began with his appointment as Assistant District Attorney, a position that had already offered him a deeper understanding of the judicial system and the community's expectations for its officers. His service there demonstrated a capacity for impartial assessment and a willingness to apply the law without favour. When his term concluded, he returned briefly to private practice, yet his experience in the prosecutor's office had prepared him for further administrative duties when they arose. As Buffalo developed into a prominent centre of commerce and industry, the demands placed upon county institutions increased. Courts heard more cases, municipal departments expanded, and the need for reliable oversight became more pressing. In this environment, the role of sheriff for Erie County required a steady presence, someone capable of managing the varied responsibilities associated with law enforcement, and civil administration, and the care of county facilities. When Cleveland accepted the position of sheriff in the early 1870s, he did so with his characteristic sense of obligation rather than the enthusiasm for public distinction. Serving as sheriff placed him at the intersection of legal authority and community welfare. The office oversaw not only the enforcement of the law, but also the management of the county jail and the handling of civil matters related to property and financial disputes. Cleveland approached these duties with the same restraint that guided his legal career. His decisions reflected a commitment to procedure and a refusal to be influenced by external pressure. Even in moments requiring difficult judgment, he maintained a deliberate and composed demeanour. The responsibilities associated with the sheriff's office also exposed him to aspects of public administration that extended beyond the courtroom. He was required to manage budgets, supervise personnel, and oversee the maintenance of facilities. These tasks, though often unremarked upon, fostered his growing familiarity with the practical demands of governance. Colleagues observed that he performed his administrative duties with precision, ensuring that public funds were used responsibly and that official records were kept in orderly condition. Such traits would, in time, become hallmarks of his approach to public office at every level. During his tenure, he also confronted tasks that tested his commitment to duty, and certain responsibilities associated with the role, particularly those related to the enforcement of judicial sentences, carried emotional weight. Cleveland carried out each obligation with quiet resolve, guided by the principle that public office required adherence to the law regardless of personal sentiment. The steadiness with which he approached these responsibilities contributed further to the respect he earned among fellow officials and citizens alike. When he completed his term as sheriff, he did not immediately pursue further office. Instead, he returned once more to private legal practice, where he resumed his work with the same methodical commitment that had defined his early career. Yet the reputation he had cultivated through years of steady service remained strong. Buffalo's residents, experiencing the transitions associated with rapid urban growth, increasingly looked to individuals who demonstrated clear judgment and an absence of political ambition. Cleveland, who consistently placed duty before personal advancement, fit this need with uncommon precision. As the city continued to expand, discussions about municipal governance grew more prominent. Issues related to public spending, infrastructure, and administrative reform occupied the attention of civic leaders. Within these conversations, Cleveland's name appeared frequently as someone whose restrained judgment and commitment to fiscal responsibility made him well suited for leadership roles. Though he had not sought recognition, the community increasingly regarded him as a figure capable of providing stability during a period of transition. By the early 1880s, the call to public service came again, this time from those who wished to introduce greater accountability into municipal administration. Citizens concerned about government efficiency advocated for leaders who demonstrated independence from political pressures. Cleveland's history of impartial conduct and his reluctance to engage in partisan activities made him an appealing candidate for roles that demanded integrity. When he was encouraged to seek the office of mayor, he did so not from personal ambition, but from a sense of responsibility toward the city that had become his home. His campaign reflected the quiet values that had guided him throughout life. He did not engage in extravagant speeches or dramatic appeals. Instead, he allowed his record, years of steady legal work, principled service as sheriff, and a reputation for fairness, to speak on his behalf. Voters, recalling his consistent commitment to the public good, responded positively to this understated approach. His election marked another step in his gradual ascent through local offices, an ascent defined not by pursuit, but by the natural recognition of his reliability. As he prepared to assume the responsibilities of mayor, Cleveland remained grounded in the habits that had defined his character since youth. He continued to live simply, maintained long working hours, and approached each new responsibility with careful study. Though the role would place him at the forefront of city administration, he carried into it the same restrained temperament that had guided his service in all prior positions. This steady rise through local offices in Buffalo formed the essential groundwork for the roles that would follow. Each position, assistant district attorney, sheriff, and ultimately mayor, expanded his understanding of public administration and deepened the trust that the community placed in him. Through these experiences, he developed not only the skills necessary for leadership, but also the quiet confidence that comes from fulfilling one's duties with integrity. The city around him continued to grow, and with it grew the responsibilities he was called upon to shoulder, always with the same measured and dependable approach. When Grover Cleveland assumed the office of mayor in the early 1880s, he entered a role that demanded both administrative clarity and a willingness to confront the inefficiencies that had gradually taken hold within the city's government. The community had elected him with a clear expectation that he would apply the same measured judgment and quiet honesty that had characterized his earlier service. In this period of expansion, Buffalo required leadership capable of guiding municipal institutions toward greater accountability, and Cleveland's reputation for restraint and fairness positioned him well for the task. Upon taking office, he approached the responsibilities before him with characteristic deliberation. He reviewed municipal records carefully, familiarized himself with ongoing projects, and sought a clear understanding of the city's financial condition. Then he did not begin with sweeping public statements or gestures meant to attract attention. Instead, he focused on gathering information, believing that sound decisions grew from thorough preparation. Colleagues observed that his manner remained consistent with the habits formed over decades, unhurried, observant, and resistant to assumptions not grounded in evidence. The challenges facing municipal government were practical in nature. As the city expanded, contracts for public works increased in number and complexity. Streets required paving, water systems needed expansion, and public buildings demanded maintenance. In many cases, the processes for awarding contracts had become influenced by long-standing informal arrangements, resulting in expenditures that were not always aligned with the city's best interests. Cleveland recognized these concerns and approached them with steady resolve. He believed that public funds should be managed with the same care as the resources of a modest household, reflecting principles of responsibility deeply rooted in his upbringing. Early in his term, he encountered proposals that would have required the city to accept arrangements involving costs he viewed as excessive. Rather than approving them, he examined the details thoroughly, weighed the financial implications, and declined to authorize expenditures that did not serve the public effectively. His decisions emphasized the importance of impartial judgment and the careful stewardship of resources. In doing so, he demonstrated that adherence to procedure mattered more to him than acquiescing to expectations formed through habit or custom. These actions, even though calm in execution, signalled a shift in municipal governance. Citizens and officials alike observed that the mayor intended to apply standards of fairness and transparency consistently, regardless of the pressures or traditions surrounding particular decisions. His conduct did not reflect opposition to individuals or groups, but a firm commitment to principle. He believed that public office required a separation between personal relationships and official responsibilities, and he maintained this separation with quiet determination. Cleveland's approach extended beyond financial oversight. He also spent considerable time examining the organization of municipal departments. He sought to understand how services were delivered, how responsibilities were assigned, and how efficiency might be improved through clearer lines of authority. His manner of inquiry was steady and unobtrusive. Rather than imposing immediate reforms, he first learned the details of existing processes, speaking with department heads and studying records with patience. This careful groundwork allowed him to identify areas where improvements could be made without disruption to essential services. The mayor's office during this period required not only administrative skill, but also an ability to set a tone for the broader work of the city. Cleveland did so not through rhetoric, but through example. His days were long and orderly, marked by hours of reading, meeting with officials, and reviewing correspondence. He made decisions only after full consideration and communicated them in clear, concise language that reflected his preference for simplicity. He neither sought praise nor emphasized his own role in the progress of the city. Instead, he viewed each accomplishment as part of a collective effort to maintain public trust and promote responsible governance. Citizens gradually perceived that the mayor's habits, his restraint, his practicality, and his consistent attention to detail were bringing a renewed sense of order to local administration. Newspapers of the time remarked on his independence, noting that he resisted influence from any group seeking preferential treatment. This independence did not arise from defiance, but from a genuine belief that public office must remain free from obligations that might compromise fairness. His conduct reassured those who valued accountability. And it encouraged confidence among residents who had grown accustomed to a less disciplined approach to municipal decision-making. The reputation he developed during this period was not dramatic but deeply rooted. People observed that he maintained the same modest lifestyle he had always lived. He walked to his office, kept his personal expenses simple, and continued to devote long hours to the responsibilities of his role. This consistency between his private habits and his public actions reinforced the trust placed in him. He appeared as a man governed by principle rather than ambition, someone whose quiet dedication offered stability during a time of civic change. Though his term as mayor was not lengthy, it left a lasting influence on the community. The reforms he introduced, measured, practical, and grounded in close study, demonstrated that a city could be managed with integrity, even amid growth and political complexity. His actions did not seek to reshape the city through sweeping innovation. Instead, they focused on restoring confidence in municipal institutions by ensuring that decisions were made thoughtfully and impartially. As his service continued, those who observed him sensed that his commitment to careful governance extended beyond local matters. He had shown an ability to balance firmness with restraint, to apply principles consistently, and to guide public institutions with a steady hand. These qualities, evident in each task he undertook, gradually brought him to the attention of leaders across the state. Without seeking broader recognition, he found himself gradually drawn toward roles that required an even greater scope of responsibility. The steady rise that had carried him from clerkship to attorney, from assistant district attorney to sheriff, and finally to mayor now positioned him for the next stage of public service. In every role, he had followed the same quiet trajectory, shaped not by pursuit but by trust. His term as mayor confirmed to many that he possessed both the discipline and the integrity required to guide public institutions with clarity. And as the city continued to evolve, he completed his work with the same composed sense of duty that had defined his life from the beginning. Grover Cleveland's transition from municipal leadership to statewide prominence occurred with an almost imperceptible gradualness. He is shaped not by ambition, but by the accumulation of trust his conduct had inspired. His tenure as mayor of Buffalo had demonstrated a model of administration characterized by clarity, restraint, and careful stewardship of public funds. Citizens across the state, observing from a distance, found in his example a reminder that public office could still be guided by principle rather than by the shifting aims of partisan interests. It was this quiet reputation that opened the path toward his election as governor, placing him at the center of state governance during a period that demanded thoughtful leadership. The political climate of the early 1880s reflected the tensions inherent in a rapidly modernizing society. Industrial growth, expanding transportation networks, and increasing urbanization had altered the daily lives of New Yorkers, from the shores of Lake Erie to the streets of Albany, where the state's administrative functions were concentrated. Within this evolving landscape, questions about public expenditure, regulatory oversight, and the influence of entrenched political groups grew increasingly prominent. Reformers throughout the state sought individuals who could reintroduce discipline and transparency into the mechanisms of government. Cleveland's conduct as mayor suggested that he possessed precisely these qualities. When he received the nomination for governor, it came as an acknowledgement of his consistent integrity rather than as a result of deliberate political maneuvering. He accepted the nomination with his customary reserve, recognizing the responsibilities that lay ahead but declining to indulge in rhetoric or self-promotion. His campaign followed the same tone that had guided his service in Buffalo. He spoke plainly, avoided exaggeration, and allowed his record to stand as the foundation of his appeal. Across towns and cities, voters responded to his reputation for impartial judgment and financial restraint. His election to the governorship marked a significant expansion of the scope of his responsibilities. As governor, he would oversee a vast system of institutions touching every aspect of public life: education, transportation, regulation of commerce, and matters concerning the welfare of the state's diverse population. Upon arriving in Albany, he approached his new role with the steady deliberation that had shaped every phase of his career. He familiarized himself with departmental reports, studied pending legislation, and sought a practical understanding of the issues confronting the state. Cleveland soon identified the need for administrative reforms similar in principle to those he'd implemented as mayor. He believed firmly that public funds should be managed with clarity and that expenditures should reflect genuine necessity. His review of proposed bills revealed patterns of spending that he viewed as inconsistent with responsible governance. When he encountered measures that imposed undue financial burdens or served narrow interests, he exercised his authority to withhold approval. His use of the veto, calm and precise, became a defining feature of his administration. Each decision was accompanied by a clear explanation rooted in the principles of accountability and fairness. These actions underscored his broader view of public service, that government existed to serve the collective good, not to provide benefits to favored groups. He sought to remind the state's institutions of the importance of restraint, particularly during a time when economic development encouraged ambitious proposals for public investment. His approach did not reject progress, but insisted that it proceed with careful consideration and respect for the resources of the people. Throughout his governorship, Cleveland maintained a disciplined routine. Reports reached his desk daily, and he devoted long hours to reviewing the details of each measure placed before him. His working days were marked by steady concentration rather than haste, and he remained attentive to the long-term implications of every decision. He communicated with department heads in direct, unembellished language, expecting the same clarity in return. This environment of orderly communication contributed to a renewed sense of purpose within the state's administrative offices. His leadership also emphasized the importance of civil service reform. He believed that public positions should be awarded based on competence rather than political affiliation, and he supported measures that promoted merit-based appointments. Though these reforms were not dramatic in their immediate effects, they represented a quiet effort to improve the long-term functioning of the state's institutions. His support for such principles aligned him with broader national movements seeking to professionalize public service during this era. The governor's presence in Albany remained consistent with his lifelong habits. He lived simply, avoided unnecessary ceremonial functions, and directed his attention toward the work that required his careful judgment. he continued to rely on deliberate study and restrained decision-making rather than on public appeals or displays of authority. His conduct reinforced the perception among citizens that he was a leader guided by principle, unaffected by the pressures of partisanship. Observers across the state noted that Cleveland filled his role with a steadiness that contrasted with the political turbulence often associated with high office. His administration signaled to many that responsible governance could be restored even in large and complex systems. He became known not only for his vetoes, but also for the calm explanations accompanying them, which articulated a clear philosophy of public responsibility. These explanations, written with precision, reflected his belief that government must maintain both financial discipline and moral clarity. As his term progressed, Cleveland's reputation expanded beyond state boundaries. National observers took interest in the governor who had introduced a sense of order and impartiality into state government. His independence, once a local attribute, now appeared as a quality of national significance. Yet despite this attention, Cleveland continued to view his role without grandeur. We understood the significance of statewide governance, but he approached each decision with the same modesty and careful judgment that had guided him since his earliest days in public service. By the time he concluded his work as governor, he had established himself as a figure of unusual steadiness in an age marked by rapid change. The trust he earned grew from the consistent application of principle to each responsibility placed before him. His governorship strengthened the foundation upon which his later national service would rest, demonstrating that the qualities cultivated in youth and refined through local office could guide even the most complex administrative duties. This quiet transition from municipal to statewide leadership marked an important turning point in his life. It signaled that the values he carried with him, clarity, restraint, and commitment to fairness, were not only relevant but necessary in guiding public institutions through times of expansion. With the conclusion of his term, Cleveland stood poised for responsibilities that extended beyond the boundaries of the state he had served with such deliberate care. Grover Cleveland's years in the governor's office unfolded gradually but steadily into a period of national recognition. What had begun as a local reputation in Buffalo and later developed into statewide respect across New York now grew into something broader, reaching observers throughout the country who were searching for public figures capable of guiding institutions with clarity and restraint. In an era when many Americans expressed concerns about the influence of political patronage, financial mismanagement, and the uneven reach of governmental authority, Cleveland's measured approach to service offered a contrast to the more turbulent tendencies of national politics. During the early 1880s, political reform movements spread across the United States. Citizens in growing cities, industrial centers, and rural communities sought leaders who demonstrated independence from entrenched systems of favoritism. Newspapers published editorials calling for a renewal of integrity in public life, and civic groups discussed the need for clearer accountability in government. Amid these discussions, Cleveland's conduct drew attention for its consistency. He did not frame himself as a reformer. Instead, his actions quietly reflected the principles reformers valued, and this distinction made him particularly appealing to those who believed that true reform emerged not from declarations, but from methodical, principled behavior over time. As governor, his decisions were closely observed by those outside New York who followed national political developments. His vetoes of bills that placed unnecessary burdens on taxpayers or served narrow interests were noted for their clarity of explanation. He wrote in a tone that was firm yet calm, reflecting his belief that transparency was essential to public trust. These writings circulated widely, allowing citizens across the country to understand his reasoning even if they had never heard him speak. His ability to communicate principle without rhetoric became one of the defining characteristics of his emerging national presence. The national environment of the time also contributed to the attention he received. The country was adjusting to the modernizing forces that followed the Civil War. Urbanization, industrial expansion, and the creation of new economic networks that stretched across states. These changes brought opportunities, but they also created challenges related to regulation, labor, and the distribution of public resources. Many Americans viewed government with a mixture of hope and uncertainty, unsure whether institutions could adapt to new demands without compromising fairness. Cleveland's approach to decision-making, quiet, cautious, rooted in study and principle, appeared to many as a stabilizing influence. Political leaders took notice as well. Within National Party circles, discussions increasingly referenced him as an example of administrative integrity. Those who sought to align their movements with reform efforts found in him a figure whose conduct supported their goals, even though he did not actively pursue alliances. He had demonstrated an ability to resist undue influence, to maintain independence from rigid partisan commitments, and to approach each question on its own merits. These traits suggested that he might contribute meaningfully to broader national governance. Despite growing recognition, Cleveland remained personally unchanged. He continued to live simply, avoided ceremonial excess, and approached his responsibilities with the same deliberate habits that had guided him since his youth. So observers noted that he resisted invitations to speak widely or to engage in public gestures associated with national aspiration. He understood the challenges of higher office, and he held a deep respect for the responsibilities entrusted to those who occupied it. His reserve during this period further reinforced the perception that he valued duty above advancement. As reform movements gained traction, national newspapers began to describe him as a figure who embodied the virtues many Americans wished to see restored in government. Articles examined his record as mayor and governor, noting the consistency of his decisions and the absence of personal ambition in his conduct. Editorialists wrote about his firm handling of public expenditures, his refusal to accept measures that lacked clear justification, and his insistence that government must serve the collective good rather than the interests of a few. These accounts reached readers across the country and contributed to the steady formation of his national reputation. Cleveland's growing prominence did not emerge suddenly. It developed incrementally, shaped by each action he took and each decision he explained with quiet clarity. This slow, steady rise reflected the natural consequence of a life lived according to principle. Observers who sought dramatic reform sometimes overlooked the value of patience and consistency, yet many citizens found comfort in the calm way Cleveland approached even the most complex questions. His presence suggested that government could be guided by deliberation rather than urgency, by fairness rather than pressure. During this period, he continued to strengthen his relationships with individuals and groups who valued transparent governance. He corresponded regularly with officials, civic leaders, and private citizens who wrote to him with concerns or questions. His replies, written in plain language, offered careful explanations and reassured correspondents that their concerns had been considered thoughtfully. Through these interactions, his influence extended beyond formal policy decisions, contributing to a broader sense of confidence in the steady functioning of government. National political conventions, which brought together delegates from across the country, began to include more frequent references to Cleveland as a potential leader on the federal stage. The attention he received did not carry the tone of excitement that often surrounds rising political figures. Instead, it had the quiet quality of recognition, an acknowledgement that someone who had demonstrated reliable judgment in local and state offices might offer the same steadiness at the national level. Delegates discussed his independence, his record of financial restraint, and his measured approach to the responsibilities of governance. Cleveland himself remained focused on the practical demands of his position as governor. He continued to examine legislation carefully, oversee administrative departments, and maintain long working days marked by the same quiet discipline that defined his earlier career. He did not publicly comment on the possibility of national office, nor did he alter his routine to cultivate such outcomes. Those who observed him closely sensed that whatever developments lay ahead would arise from the natural progression of trust rather than from deliberate strategy. By the conclusion of his governorship, the national attention surrounding him had reached a steady and unmistakable presence. People far beyond New York now associated his name with the principles of honest administration and clear judgment. His life had unfolded without haste, marked by steady movement from responsibility to responsibility, each one accepted with the same sense of duty. This gradual accumulation of trust positioned him for the next stage of public service, one that would carry him beyond state lines and into the broad arena of federal leadership. By the mid-1880s, and the quiet accumulation of trust that had marked Grover Cleveland's life had grown into a national force. Citizens across the country, observing from cities, towns, and rural communities alike, had come to associate his name with the principles of clarity, restraint, and administrative honesty. The national political climate, shaped by decades of evolving party structures and the complex demands of a rapidly modernizing nation, reached a moment in 1884 when many Americans sought a leader who could restore confidence in federal institutions. Into this atmosphere, Cleveland's candidacy for the presidency emerged with an almost natural inevitability. Political leaders, editorialists, and civic groups had followed his tenure as governor of New York with growing interest. They noted his careful explanations of each veto, his insistence on responsible use of public funds, and his independence from political factions. These qualities resonated strongly at a time when concerns about corruption and patronage formed a prominent part of public discourse. Delegates gathering for the National Convention considered various candidates, yet Cleveland's name carried a sense of assurance, an impression that he would apply to federal service the same integrity that had marked every stage of his earlier career. His nomination did not result from dramatic gestures or emotional appeals. Instead, it followed from the steady recognition that his character aligned with the reform-minded spirit of the period. When the convention formally selected him, he accepted with measured dignity. His response reflected the same tone that had guided his time as mayor and governor, calm, conscientious, and grounded in an understanding of the weight of public responsibility. He did not react with triumph. Rather, he viewed the nomination as another step in a long continuum of duty. As the presidential campaign began, Cleveland maintained his characteristic restraint. Campaigns of the era often relied on large gatherings, displays of enthusiasm, and vigorous partisan rhetoric. Cleveland, however, remained committed to his quiet habits, allowing surrogates and supporters to speak on his behalf while he continued to focus on the responsibilities of office. He communicated through formal statements that emphasized simplicity, clarity, and adherence to principle. He avoided exaggeration and refused to make promises that extended beyond what he believed government could reasonably offer. Across the country, his message found a receptive audience. Voters who had grown accustomed to shifting political tides recognized in Cleveland a figure who seemed less interested in personal advancement than in the steady functioning of public institutions. Meanwhile, his opponent was associated with a long career in national politics, shaped by alliances and conflicts that reflected the intricate workings of party systems. Cleveland's relative newness to the national stage, combined with his reputation for independence, offered a contrast that appealed to many. The campaign unfolded in an atmosphere of close competition. Newspapers published extensive commentary, examining Cleveland's record and comparing it with national concerns. Throughout these discussions, a consistent theme emerged: his adherence to duty. Even critics who questioned specific decisions often acknowledged his integrity. Supporters emphasized his willingness to stand apart from pressure, noting that he had demonstrated this quality repeatedly as governor. The election became, for many voters, a referendum on whether the federal government could be guided by steady principle rather than by entrenched factionalism. As the election approached, Cleveland continued to avoid spectacle. He remained focused on thoughtful communication, careful reflection, and the orderly completion of his responsibilities in Albany. His days followed a familiar rhythm: reviewing documents, meeting with advisors, and quietly preparing for the possibility of a new role. His manner suggested neither eagerness nor hesitation, only the calm acceptance of whatever decision the electorate would render. When the votes were tallied, Cleveland emerged victorious. His election marked a significant moment in American political life, not only because he would become the first Democratic president elected after the Civil War, but also because he represented a return to an approach grounded in administrative restraint and personal integrity. The margin of victory was narrow, reflecting the divided nature of the electorate, yet the significance of the outcome extended beyond numbers. It signalled that the country had chosen a leader whose public life had been shaped by steady progress rather than by ambition. The transition to federal office invited him to shift from state administration to the broader field of national governance. As he prepared to travel to Washington, D.C., he approached the change with a composed clarity. He reviewed federal responsibilities with the same attention he had applied to municipal and state matters, seeking to understand the structures, departments, and expectations he would soon encounter. His long-standing habits, careful study, restraint in judgment, and consistency in conduct, guided him as he considered the challenges ahead. Upon arriving in the capital, Cleveland found himself surrounded by the symbols of national authority: formal buildings, administrative offices, and the long-established patterns of federal governance. Yet he continued to carry with him the values formed during his early years in the minister's household, refined through decades of legal practice and public service. He prepared for his inauguration without pomp, focusing instead on the responsibilities he would soon assume. The inauguration itself marked the formal beginning of his presidency, but for Cleveland it represented a continuation of steady duty. He delivered his address in the same clear and measured tone that characterized all his public statements. He emphasized the importance of responsible financial management, civil service reform, and a commitment to fairness. He did not offer dramatic visions or sweeping promises. His words reflected his belief that government strength lay in consistent, principled action, rather than in grand declarations. Following the ceremony, Cleveland entered the White House, now the center of his daily routine. He approached the tasks before him with the same quiet discipline that had guided his earlier offices. Papers accumulated on his desk, meetings filled his days, and the responsibilities of national leadership demanded sustained attention. Yet his habits remained consistent: deliberate review, careful reasoning, and a refusal to make decisions without full understanding. His arrival in the White House marked not the culmination of ambition, but the extension of a life shaped by responsibility. The qualities that had defined his rise, integrity, restraint, and methodical judgment, now became the guiding principles of his administration. As he settled into the routines of federal service, he carried with him the stillness of his early years, the discipline of his legal work, and the quiet trust of those who had supported him at each stage of his steady ascent. As Grover Cleveland settled into the rhythms of his first presidential term, he approached each responsibility with the same deliberate steadiness that had characterized his earlier service. The federal institutions he now guided were broader in scope than those he had known at the municipal or state level, yet the underlying principles remained familiar to him. He believed firmly that public office required clarity, restraint, and fidelity to establish processes. These beliefs shaped each decision he made, giving his administration a tone of measured continuity rather than sudden change. The daily work of the presidency began early and continued through long, orderly hours. Cleveland reviewed correspondence with careful attention, studied reports from federal departments, and examined legislation with the same thoroughness he had applied throughout his career. His desk accumulated documents relating to the nation's finances, regulatory concerns, public lands, veterans' affairs, and the responsibilities of distant territories. Though the scale had expanded, his method remained unchanged. He did not form conclusions until he had examined every relevant detail. Advisers observed that he often worked late into the evening, reading quietly by lamplight, unwilling to compromise the completeness of his preparation. One of the earliest areas in which he exercised significant influence was civil service reform. Cleveland believed deeply that federal positions should be awarded based on merit rather than political obligation. Throughout the country, there existed long-standing customs in which offices were distributed as rewards for partisan loyalty. He recognized that such practices undermined public trust and hindered the efficient functioning of government. In response, he supported standards that required examinations for certain positions and insulated employees from dismissal on purely political grounds. His actions reflected a gradual but firm shift toward professionalism within federal service. Another prominent aspect of his administration was his approach to legislation. Cleveland viewed the veto not as an instrument of conflict, but as a necessary tool for maintaining fiscal responsibility and preserving the integrity of government. When bills reached his desk that he believed would unduly burden taxpayers, he returned them to Congress with written explanations that were calm, detailed, and grounded in principle. His messages avoided rhetorical embellishment, yet they expressed in measured language the importance of clear justification for every expenditure of public funds. These explanations became widely known for their precision, reinforcing his reputation as a steward of the nation's finances. Many of the measures he declined involved pensions and appropriations. Throughout the country, veterans of the Civil War sought support in their later years, and Congress frequently passed private bills granting pensions to individuals. Cleveland approached each case individually, reviewing the evidence provided and approving only those he believed consistent with the law and the purpose of such support. His decisions were not universally welcomed, yet they were guided by a consistent principle: that public assistance must be distributed fairly and according to established standards, rather than through appeals influenced by sentiment or political pressure. His handling of federal lands reflected similar restraint. During this era, vast areas of Western Territory remained under government control, and various groups sought access for settlement, agriculture, or commercial use. Cleveland insisted that the administration of these lands be conducted with fairness, protecting the public interest and preventing the misuse of resources. He supported investigations into fraudulent claims and took steps to ensure that land distribution followed legal requirements. His actions contributed to the preservation of large areas for genuine settlement, rather than speculative gain. The first term also required attention to matters of interstate commerce, tariff policy, and the regulation of industry, issues shaped by the expanding economic networks of the late 19th century. Cleveland believed that trade policies should be clear, and that revenue measures should reflect the needs of the nation rather than the preferences of individual sectors. He supported efforts to reduce unnecessary tariffs, viewing them as burdens that fell disproportionately on consumers. His speeches and messages on this subject were careful and analytical, offering a measured perspective rather than a dramatic call for change. In foreign affairs, he favoured a calm, deliberate approach. The United States maintained relations with nations across the world, yet Cleveland preferred diplomacy grounded in clarity and mutual respect, rather than expansive ambition. He reviewed treaties with caution, ensuring that they aligned with national interests and respected established principles of law. This steady approach helped maintain stable relations during a period of growing international complexity. Throughout his first term, Cleveland's personal habits remained unchanged. He lived simply, avoided unnecessary ceremony, and maintained a routine marked by work rather than display. His evenings offered moments of quiet, yet even these were often spent reviewing documents or preparing for the next day's responsibilities. Observers noted that he continued to value privacy, choosing calm domestic routines over the social events that often fill the calendar of public figures, and this consistency between personal conduct and administrative philosophy reinforced the sense that he governed not for personal advancement, but from a deep respect for the responsibilities of his office. His marriage during this term brought additional attention, yet even this event was conducted with dignity and restraint. The public expressed interest in the ceremony and the couple's life, but Cleveland maintained his preference for quiet routines, shielding his household from the more intrusive aspects of national attention. The stability of his domestic life provided balance amid the steady demands of political leadership. As his term progressed, Cleveland continued to earn recognition for his independence. He did not hesitate to stand apart from members of his own party when he believed principle required it. Colleagues sometimes described him as firm to the point of immovability. Yet this firmness arose not from stubbornness, but from a deliberate commitment to the standards he had upheld throughout his life. He viewed the presidency as a trust, one requiring unwavering clarity of judgment, even when public or political pressures encouraged compromise. By the end of his first term, Cleveland had established a record defined by administrative discipline and financial restraint. His use of the veto, his insistence on merit-based service, and his careful oversight of expenditures contributed to a renewed sense of order in federal governance. Though his approach did not inspire dramatic excitement, it fostered a quiet confidence in the principles guiding the administration. As the nation prepared for another election, and Cleveland stood as a figure whose leadership reflected the habits and values of a lifetime, the calm determination with which he approached each task had shaped his presidency, just as it had shaped every earlier stage of his career. Whether the electorate would choose to continue along this path was a question soon to be decided, but the foundation of his first term remained clear: a steady commitment to fairness, careful judgment, and the orderly functioning of government. When the presidential election of 1888 concluded, Grover Cleveland faced a transition that he accepted with the same calm composure that had guided every stage of his public life. The election had been closely contested, with the outcome shaped by complex regional dynamics and the shifting priorities of a nation navigating industrial expansion. Although Cleveland won the popular vote, the distribution of electoral votes resulted in his opponent's victory. The presidency, which he had approached as a solemn trust rather than a personal triumph, now passed to another administration. Cleveland responded to the result without bitterness, recognizing that the decision of the electorate, however narrow, was a defining feature of the nation's system of governance. The closing months of his term unfolded with the quiet orderliness he preferred. He ensured that the responsibilities of the office were conducted with dignity until the very end. he continued to review documents, sign necessary orders, and meet with department heads, maintaining the routines that had shaped his days for years. His departure from the White House carried no trace of haste or undue ceremony. He left with a simple acknowledgement of the work completed and a steady acceptance of the work that now belonged to others. Cleveland's return to private life marked a rare moment of stillness after years filled with the demands of public service. He and his family settled in New York City, where he resumed the quieter rhythms of civilian existence. His return to legal practice provided him with familiar routines, allowing him to draw once again upon the disciplined habits that had shaped his early professional years. He joined a law firm and approached each case with the steady attention that had defined his earlier career in Buffalo, finding reassurance in the orderly tasks of reading, preparation, and measured argument. Life in New York City offered a contrast to the quieter environments in which he had spent much of his life, yet Cleveland adapted comfortably. The city was a centre of commerce, finance, and communication, filled with the movement of goods and the efforts of countless individuals shaping the emerging modern society. Cleveland, however, did not immerse himself in urban excitement. He preferred quiet evenings at home, long hours devoted to reading, and thoughtful conversations with a small circle of friends. His days followed a steady routine, reflecting both his practical nature and his preference for environments grounded in moderation. During this period, his public reputation persisted even as he resumed private work. Citizens throughout the country continued to view him as a figure associated with principled leadership. Newspapers often speculated about his future, wondering whether he might again accept national office. Cleveland did not engage with these speculations. His temperament remained resistant to ambition, and he believed that the immediate task before him was to fulfill his obligations as a private citizen with the same conscientiousness he had applied to public duties. He responded to correspondence thoughtfully, accepted invitations sparingly, and refrained from statements that might be interpreted as positioning for future elections. Domestic life played a significant role during these years. His marriage had brought stability and companionship, and the quieter pace of private life offered him time to enjoy moments of family routine that had been difficult to maintain during his presidency. He spent evenings in calm reflection, engaged in reading or quiet conversation, often reviewing literature on law, history, or public administration. These pursuits grounded him, allowing him to maintain a sense of continuity with the values that had shaped his earliest years. Yet even in the privacy of civilian life, matters of public concern continued to reach him. Citizens wrote seeking guidance on questions of government or policy, and Cleveland responded with measured clarity. His letters often reflected the same principles that had governed his presidency: fairness, restraint, and the importance of responsible administration. Though he no longer held office, he remained attentive to national developments, observing political debates with quiet interest rather than active participation. His time away from public office also allowed him to reflect more deeply on the responsibilities of leadership, where he believed that government required a commitment to principle that transcended the personal ambitions of office holders. The experience of losing the election did not diminish his sense of purpose. Instead, it affirmed the importance of public trust. He remained convinced that the nation needed leaders who could act with clarity and impartiality, qualities he continued to cultivate in his own conduct. In these years, Cleveland also returned to writing. His reflections, correspondence, and occasional statements for publication maintained the steady, thoughtful tone familiar from his official messages. He wrote not to advocate for personal advancement, but to offer clarity on issues of governance. His words carried weight because they reflected a life dedicated to methodical judgment rather than emotional appeal. Through these writings, he maintained a quiet connection with the broader public, contributing to the national conversation without seeking to influence it for his own benefit. As the political climate of the late 1880s and early 1890s shifted, economic challenges and debates about tariff policy gained prominence. Cleveland observed these developments with attentive calm. Many of the questions at the centre of national debate concerned principles he had addressed during his first term, particularly the structure of tariffs and the balance between government revenue and consumer costs. His writings on these subjects revealed a continued belief in the importance of fairness and efficiency in public finance. While Cleveland did not publicly express aspirations for renewed leadership, discussions about the next election gradually began to include his name. Reform-minded groups, recalling the restraint and clarity he had brought to federal administration, considered whether he might again serve as a stabilizing presence. His independence from entrenched interests and his consistency in principle remained appealing to many who sought greater accountability in government. The possibility of a return to public life grew silently, shaped not by his initiative, but by the lingering trust of those who remembered his earlier service. In time, these conversations would lead him back toward national responsibility. Yet during these years of private life, Cleveland remained firmly grounded in the steady routines that had shaped him from the beginning. He lived quietly, worked diligently, and maintained an unwavering respect for the responsibilities of citizenship. The calm between administrations allowed him to rest, reflect, and observe, preparing him, without intention, for the responsibilities that would soon re-emerge. The years that Grover Cleveland spent outside public office formed a period of quiet observation and deliberate steadiness, unfolding against a backdrop of national change. Although he resumed the routines of private legal practice and domestic life, the country continued to move forward with a momentum shaped by industrial expansion, demographic shifts, and evolving political priorities. From his residence in New York City, Cleveland watched these developments with calm attention, neither seeking to influence events nor withdrawing from an interest in the nation he had served. His days followed a steady pattern. He travelled to his law office, performed the tasks expected of him with methodical care, and returned home to evenings of reading, correspondence, and family quiet. The transition from the structured responsibilities of the presidency to the silence of private work might have unsettled a man driven by ambition, but Cleveland adapted with the same composure he had applied to every change in his life. He viewed public office not as a possession but as a trust. Once that trust had passed to another, he accepted the shift without disappointment, returning instead to the foundational habits that had guided him since youth. Yet national circumstances ensured that he could not completely separate himself from public affairs. Economic debates grew increasingly prominent, especially those surrounding tariff legislation. The tariff had been a subject of careful consideration during his presidency, and Cleveland maintained a belief that excessive duties placed unnecessary burdens upon the country. Newspapers frequently referenced his earlier messages to Congress, noting that his call for tariff reform remained relevant as national prices, wages, and trade balances became points of concern. Although he refrained from public advocacy, his past statements continued to influence public discourse, creating a quiet thread of continuity between his former service and current debates. Cleveland received a steady flow of letters from citizens seeking clarification or perspective on matters of governance. Some wrote simply to express continued trust in his judgment. Others asked specific questions about tariffs, public expenditures, or civil service reform. He answered selectively, always with measured clarity. His replies did not attempt to shape political outcomes. Instead, they reflected the calm reasoning he believed essential to public life. Those who read his letters often described them as steady and unembellished, offering reassuring guidance without persuasion. During this period, Cleveland also became a father, and the rhythms of family life softened the edges of public interest surrounding him. His home provided a space of quiet order, where the concerns of politics gave way to the simple routines of domesticity. These years offered moments of calm reflection, allowing him to experience a gentler pace than the demands of the presidency had allowed. He found satisfaction in the familiar structures of daily living, reading extensively, and maintaining correspondence with friends and colleagues who valued thoughtful conversation. Even as he embraced the privacy of civilian life, Cleveland remained attentive to the broader developments unfolding across the country. The national climate grew increasingly shaped by questions of economic fairness, labour relations, and the extent to which government should intervene in the expanding industrial economy. Strikes, fluctuations in currency values, and the pressures placed upon workers and businesses alike created a sense of uncertainty. Cleveland observed these developments with deliberate reflection, recalling the principles that had guided him through earlier decisions: restraint, clarity, and the belief that public policy must serve the collective good rather than the interests of a select few. In these years, various political groups, particularly those favouring reform, continued to view Cleveland as a figure who embodied the qualities they believed essential to federal leadership. Though he did not seek renewed office, many saw in him a calm counterbalance to the prevailing turbulence. Articles appeared in newspapers across the country discussing his earlier administration, his financial restraint, and his handling of public responsibilities. His name continued to hold a place in the national consciousness, not because of active campaigning, but because he represented a consistent ideal at a time when many citizens sought steady guidance. Meanwhile, economic debates intensified. Concerns about tariff rates grew sharper, with various industries advocating for either protection or reduction depending on their circumstances. Mark Cleveland's earlier message urging tariff reform, written near the end of his first term, was frequently revisited. Analysts noted its clarity and prescience, observing that its central argument had become more relevant as the national economy evolved. Although Cleveland himself remained silent publicly, his earlier statements served as a reference point for those seeking a clear articulation of principles. Political gatherings in different parts of the country began to mention Cleveland's name with increasing regularity. Delegates and civic leaders wondered whether he might again be willing to accept national responsibility. They pointed to his earlier record as evidence that he could guide the country through debates that required both steadiness and accountability. Cleveland received these discussions with his characteristic reserve. He neither encouraged nor discouraged them. He believed that public service, when it came, should arise from the trust of others rather than from personal ambition. The years between administrations also allowed him the space to reflect on his earlier experiences in office. He understood the weight of the presidency and the demands it placed upon those who occupied it. His reflections did not lead him toward a desire to reclaim power. Instead, they deepened his appreciation for the seriousness of the role and for the importance of guiding government through principle rather than impulse. He remained convinced that the enduring strength of the nation rested not in dramatic gestures, but in the quiet consistency of thoughtful administration. As the early 1890s approached, the national mood continued to shift, and many citizens felt that the concerns raised during Cleveland's earlier presidency, financial responsibility, tariff reform, and the professionalization of public service, required renewed attention. Observers noticed that the debates of the moment aligned closely with the issues Cleveland had addressed with such clarity. Gradually and almost imperceptibly, the possibility of his return to public office gained strength, shaped not by his actions, but by the consistent trust he had earned over decades of service. Cleveland, still grounded in quiet routines, remained attentive to these developments without altering his manner. He continued his legal work, maintained his correspondence, and lived with the same measured simplicity that had guided his life since youth. Yet those around him sensed that the country's shifting needs were drawing him, quietly and steadily, toward renewed public responsibility. The balance between private reflection and national expectation grew more pronounced, setting the stage for a transition that would soon unfold. As the early 1890s advanced, the national conversation began to circle steadily back toward the principles Grover Cleveland had articulated throughout his public life. Economic concerns, tariff debates, and questions of governmental responsibility had come to define the political landscape, creating an atmosphere in which citizens sought leadership grounded in clarity and restraint. Though Cleveland had remained quietly dedicated to private pursuits in New York City, his earlier messages regarding fiscal discipline and administrative integrity continued to resonate across the country. In time, these themes converged to draw him once again into the center of national attention. Political groups that favored reform observed with increasing concern the persistence of high tariff rates and the growing influence of certain economic interests. They saw in Cleveland someone who had not only spoken about these issues but had acted consistently according to principle. His earlier vetoes, focused explanations, and disciplined approach to federal administration offered a model that many believed could guide the nation through the uncertainties of the decade. As discussions of potential candidates for the 1892 election unfolded, Cleveland's name appeared not simply as a familiar option, but as a figure whose earlier service seemed to align with the moment's demands. Cleveland had not sought this renewed interest. He had remained quietly content with private life, attentive to his family and his profession, and cautious about the responsibilities of public office. Yet letters and inquiries began to arrive with increasing frequency, many expressing confidence in his judgment and urging him to consider returning to national service. He approached these communications with his typical reserve, offering neither encouragement nor dismissal. Instead, he acknowledged them with calm appreciation, maintaining his belief that public service should arise from trust rather than from personal aspiration. As the Democratic National Convention approached, the momentum surrounding his potential candidacy grew steadily. Delegates convening in cities across the country discussed the qualities they hoped to find in their nominee. Many recalled Cleveland's early insistence that government expenditures be justified with clarity. Others remembered his commitment to merit-based civil service or his quiet, methodical approach to the responsibilities of the presidency. His record offered a sense of predictability at a time when the nation sought direction rooted in principle. When the convention met, discussions coalesced naturally around his name. Delegates found reassurance in the steadiness of his earlier administration, and many believed that his return to office could restore balance to federal policy debates. By the time the voting concluded, Cleveland had secured the nomination, becoming the first former president since the Civil War to be chosen once more as his party's candidate. He accepted the nomination with a composed sense of duty, yet fully aware of the challenges that awaited but guided by the same understanding of public responsibility that had shaped every phase of his career. The campaign that followed contrasted sharply with the tumult of the era. While the country faced discussions about labour unrest, economic transitions, and shifting patterns of trade, Cleveland maintained a quiet and restrained presence. He did not engage in extensive public speaking tours. Instead, he prepared thoughtful statements that outlined his perspective on the nation's needs, emphasizing fairness, clarity, and the responsible management of public funds. His tone remained measured, avoiding any suggestion of dramatization. Supporters across the country found reassurance in his consistency, recognizing in his calm reasoning a steadying influence. The central issue of the campaign remained tariff reform. Cleveland argued that excessively high duties distorted economic relationships and placed undue burdens upon ordinary citizens. His position, articulated with characteristic clarity, drew upon principles he had expressed years earlier. Yet the nation's shifting economic conditions lent new urgency to the debate. Many voters believed that he approached the matter with a rare combination of knowledge and restraint, shaped by years of careful thought rather than immediate pressures. As the election approached, the contrast between Cleveland and his opponent became increasingly evident. One represented continuity with existing tariff policies, while the other offered a calm and reasoned alternative grounded in fiscal responsibility. Observers noted that Cleveland's steady, unembellished style remained unchanged from his earlier campaigns. He made no attempt to stir public emotion. Instead, he trusted that voters who valued clarity and principle would respond to a message rooted in long-standing conviction. When the votes were counted, Cleveland secured a clear victory. He became the only president in American history to serve 2 non-consecutive terms, a distinction that reflected the unusual pattern of his career, one shaped not by ambition, but by enduring public trust. The electorate's decision signalled its desire for renewed discipline and for a leader who could guide the nation through economic uncertainties with steadiness and impartial judgment. As he prepared to return to Washington, D.C., Cleveland approached the transition with familiar composure. His reflections during this period carried a quiet seriousness, shaped by an understanding that the responsibilities ahead would differ markedly from those of his first administration. The economic climate had grown more fragile, and national tensions required careful attention. Yet he remained firmly rooted in the values that had guided him since youth: patience, clarity, and the belief that public office must be conducted with fairness and restraint. His return to the White House marked not a restoration of earlier circumstances, but the beginning of a new chapter in which he would face different challenges than those he had confronted before. The trust placed in him reflected not only confidence in his past service, but also a belief that his temperament, calm, principled, and deliberate, would provide stability during a time of national transition. Cleveland entered his second presidency with a quiet awareness of the work ahead. He felt no sense of triumph. Instead, he acknowledged the steady unfolding of duty. The election of 1892 did not mark a return to the past, but the continuation of a lifelong commitment to public service, one shaped by integrity, defined by restraint, and strengthened by the quiet confidence that the nation had again placed in him. When Grover Cleveland returned to the presidency in 1893, he entered an environment markedly different from the one he had left 4 years earlier. The nation, though growing in population and industrial reach, moved under currents of financial uncertainty that had begun to unsettle businesses, banks, and workers. Cleveland, and now more seasoned and reflective, approached the office with the same quiet steadiness that had guided him throughout his life. Yet the challenges awaiting him would require a level of persistence and calm deliberation even greater than before. Shortly after he assumed office in Washington, D.C., signs of economic instability became more pronounced. Railroads struggled under heavy debt, financial institutions reported diminished reserves, and agricultural regions faced declining prices for their crops. These pressures, accumulating gradually, converged into what would become one of the most significant financial disruptions of the century. The Panic of 1893 unfolded with a suddenness that caught many unprepared, but Cleveland, rooted in the principles of clarity and caution, approached the crisis not with alarm but with deliberate attention to its causes. He devoted long hours to studying reports from the Treasury and financial advisors, seeking to understand the underlying forces shaping the crisis. Silver policy emerged as a central concern. In previous years, legislation had required the government to purchase large quantities of silver, issuing currency backed in part by these reserves. Cleveland believed that this practice weakened confidence in the nation's financial stability. The divergence between the market value of silver and the face value of currency contributed to uncertainty among investors, and he feared that continued adherence to such policies would deepen the economic strain. His response, characteristically measured, and centered on seeking repeal of the legislation that mandated ongoing silver purchases. He did not frame the issue in dramatic terms. Instead, he presented it as a matter requiring clear reasoning and practical decision-making. He communicated to Congress that restoring confidence depended on halting the policies that had contributed to financial imbalance. His explanations emphasized fairness and responsibility, urging legislators to consider the long-term stability of the nation rather than the immediate pressures of regional interests. The debate that followed was extensive, reflecting the varied concerns of a nation composed of industrial centers, agricultural regions, and communities experiencing the crisis differently. Throughout this period, Cleveland maintained a calm and consistent presence. He continued to work long hours, meeting with members of Congress, reviewing correspondence from citizens, and studying the evolving financial reports. His manner remained patient and steady, demonstrating his belief that complex challenges required thoughtful analysis rather than haste. When repeal was finally enacted, it did not immediately resolve the economic unrest. The crisis had deep roots that extended beyond monetary policy. Businesses continued to close, unemployment rose, and local governments struggled to meet the needs of their communities. Cleveland observed these difficulties with quiet empathy, recognizing the strain placed upon families across the country. Yet he remained committed to the belief that sound financial principles would provide the foundation for recovery. His decisions reflected a long-term perspective grounded in fiscal restraint, as even when such choices carried the weight of unpopularity. Amid these challenges, he continued to oversee the broad duties of federal administration. Departments required guidance, international relations required attention, and domestic policies demanded continued oversight. Cleveland approached each responsibility with his familiar habits: careful reading, methodical decision-making, and a refusal to yield to external pressures that conflicted with his principles. Advisors observed that his concentration remained steady, anchored in routines that preserved order during a turbulent time. Tariff policy, another long-standing concern, also returned to national debate. Cleveland supported efforts to reduce excessively high duties, believing that lower tariffs would benefit consumers and promote fairness. While he played a limited formal role in drafting the legislation that followed, he encouraged measures consistent with his belief in reasonable and equitable public finance. His involvement reflected a recognition that tariff reform, though complex, aligned with the values he had articulated for years. His leadership style remained consistent throughout the second term: quiet, firm, and grounded in principle. He avoided displays of force or partisanship, maintaining instead a steady reliance on clarity and preparation. He sought solutions that aligned with the long-term health of the nation, even when difficult or slow to realize. Citizens observing from afar recognized that he approached the presidency not as a platform for personal prominence, but as a place of responsibility requiring patience and consistency. During these years, and Cleveland also faced personal and physical challenges. The weight of the economic crisis combined with the demands of office placed significant strain upon him, yet he continued to carry out his duties with measured focus. His household provided moments of quiet balance, offering him refuge from the constant flow of official demands. Even so, his days remained filled with reading, correspondence, and meetings, reflecting his belief in thorough preparation. Foreign affairs during this period required attention as well, Although he favoured restraint in international matters, disputes and negotiations continued to arise. He approached them with the same commitment to principle that guided his domestic decisions. Treaties, agreements, and diplomatic discussions were handled through careful analysis, and with each action grounded in the belief that the United States should act with fairness and respect for established norms. As the decade progressed, the economic situation began to stabilize slowly. While recovery unfolded unevenly, confidence gradually returned to financial markets and businesses. Throughout this process, Cleveland remained consistent in his approach, demonstrating an unwavering belief in the principles that had guided him through the crisis. His steady leadership during this time, though often quiet and understated, provided a sense of continuity amid national uncertainty. By the end of his second term, Cleveland had guided the nation through one of its most challenging financial periods. His decisions, shaped by lifelong habits of clarity and restraint, reflected his steadfast commitment to governing through principle rather than expedience. Although the burdens of the era had been considerable, he completed his work with the same composed sense of duty that had defined his entire public career. As he prepared once again to step away from national office, he did so with a quiet understanding of the weight of the years behind him. His presidency, shaped by challenges and marked by steady resolve, reflected a lifetime of service rooted in careful judgment. The nation he had served would continue to evolve, but his approach, calm, principled and deliberate, remained a lasting example of the role that steady leadership could play in times of uncertainty. As Grover Cleveland continued through the demanding years of his second administration, the atmosphere of national strain remained a steady presence across the country. Economic pressures, tensions surrounding labour, and shifting patterns of industry all contributed to an environment in which each decision carried significant weight. Cleveland, grounded in habits long established, approached these challenges with the same measured persistence that had guided him through earlier periods of responsibility. His days unfolded with calm regularity, even as the nation around him experienced fluctuations that tested the resilience of its institutions. One of the defining features of this period was the need to navigate the relationship between the federal government and the increasingly complex industrial economy. Businesses continued to grow in scale. Transportation networks expanded across multiple states, and financial markets played a more prominent role in shaping national outcomes. Cleveland believed firmly that government should act with fairness, avoiding sudden interventions while ensuring that legal standards were upheld. He understood that the institutions of a modernizing society required clarity of purpose, especially in times of economic disruption. Labor unrest emerged as one of the most visible manifestations of national strain. Workers in various industries, facing long hours, uncertain wages, and the effects of financial hardship, organized strikes to express their grievances. Although Cleveland had long believed that government should intervene cautiously in private disputes, he also held that federal authority must be used when necessary to maintain order and preserve the functioning of essential services. When a significant railway strike disrupted the movement of mail and interstate commerce, he weighed the issue with deliberate seriousness. His decision to support limited federal intervention was guided not by inclination toward force, but by the belief that the uninterrupted movement of communication and goods was fundamental to national stability. This action reflected his consistent belief in the rule of law. Cleveland approached each situation with attention to its specific circumstances, always considering the broader implications for the country. He did not respond with urgency or emotion. Instead, he sought the calm clarity that had defined his approach to governance since his earliest days in public service. Observers sometimes misunderstood his restraint as indifference, but those who followed his career closely recognized that his quiet demeanor revealed his deep commitment to the principles he held. Another significant area of policy during this period concerned the nation's currency system, which remained a subject of intense debate. The question of silver and gold continued to divide citizens, legislators, and financial leaders. Cleveland's position, formed through years of study and reflection, emphasized the importance of maintaining a stable and reliable currency. He believed that the strength of the nation depended on confidence in its financial institutions, and he viewed unregulated expansion of silver currency as a risk to that stability. His persistence on this issue, even in the face of strong opposition, reflected his belief that public trust required consistency and careful stewardship. As the debate unfolded, Cleveland's communications with Congress remained examples of his characteristic precision. His messages explained the financial implications of various proposals, emphasizing principles rather than political alignment. He expressed concern that fluctuating currency values could deepen economic unrest, affecting both workers and businesses. Through these statements, he sought to guide the nation toward decisions that would promote long-term stability, even if immediate difficulties persisted. During this period, Cleveland also remained attentive to the broader responsibilities of the federal government. Matters of public lands, Native American policy, and administrative organization all required thoughtful oversight. He supported measures that protected public resources from misuse, believing that the nation's land should benefit current and future generations. His actions reflected an understanding of stewardship shaped by the modest upbringing of his youth, extended now to the responsibilities of a growing country. Foreign affairs during this time required steady and measured guidance. Though the nation's focus remained largely domestic, Cleveland approached international matters with the same clarity that defined his domestic policy. He believed that the United States should avoid unnecessary entanglements, while upholding principles of fairness and international respect. Treaties and diplomatic communications crossed his desk with regularity, each receiving his careful attention. His responses were thoughtful and restrained, reflecting his understanding that a stable international presence supported the nation's overall well-being. Throughout these years of national strain, Cleveland's personal discipline remained unchanged. He continued to devote long hours to reading reports, studying legislation, and reviewing correspondence from both officials and private citizens. His household provided moments of quiet, yet even in these settings he often carried with him the responsibilities of his office, mindful of the weight they required him to bear. The peaceful rhythms of home life offered balance, but they did not remove him from the steady demands of public service. Despite the challenges of the era, Cleveland's persistence in applying principle to policy did not waver. His decisions, though sometimes difficult, were shaped by a desire to uphold fairness and maintain stability. Critics occasionally argued that he adhered too firmly to certain views, yet this firmness reflected not inflexibility, but a lifetime of disciplined reasoning. The slow and deliberate habits cultivated in childhood, strengthened through legal practice and refined in earlier offices, informed every choice he made. As the nation gradually began to stabilize, the effects of his efforts became clearer. Economic conditions improved slowly, and while recovery was uneven, signs of greater confidence emerged. Through this period, Cleveland's consistent leadership offered a sense of continuity. He had not sought dramatic transformation, but rather a steady path through uncertain times, one grounded in the belief that thoughtful administration provided the surest foundation for national progress. These years of persistence reveal the depth of his commitment to public responsibility. Even in moments when the nation expressed frustration or uncertainty, Cleveland held firmly to the principles that had guided him throughout his life. His leadership during this time demonstrated not only his dedication to duty, but also the quiet strength that arises from long-practiced discipline. As his second administration continued, the values he carried with him remained clear: fairness in policy, restraint in judgment, and unwavering trust in the quiet power of steady governance. As Grover Cleveland's second term moved into its final months, the atmosphere surrounding his administration grew noticeably quieter. The intense debates that had defined much of the early and middle years of his presidency began to settle into a calmer rhythm, even as many of the nation's challenges continued to require careful attention. Cleveland, shaped by decades of measured practice, approached this closing chapter with a steady awareness of his responsibilities and without anticipation of personal closure or finality. For him, public service had always rested on the principle of fulfilling one's duty with clarity, regardless of the moment in the electoral cycle. The administrative tasks before him required the same quiet persistence that had guided his earlier years in office. Reports continued to arrive daily on the nation's finances, on the administration of federal lands, on the workings of public institutions, and on the continued effects of economic recovery. Cleveland reviewed each with deliberate care, intent on leaving the office in stable condition for his successor. He believed that transitions in government should be orderly and grounded in continuity, rather than marked by abrupt shifts in policy or tone. His dedication to this principle shaped every action he took during these months. Though the nation had begun to recover from the depth of the earlier economic crisis, the effects of those difficult years remained visible. Businesses remained cautious, agricultural prices fluctuated, and labor questions continued to surface in various regions. Cleveland understood that his administration's efforts, though steady, could not erase the full impact of the crisis. Yet he also recognized that the policies he'd supported, rooted in fiscal restraint and administrative clarity, had contributed to an environment in which gradual recovery could occur. This understanding guided his reflections as he prepared to step away from the presidency. During this closing period, Cleveland maintained his commitment to civil service reform. He believed that public offices should operate independently of undue political influence, and he continued to support the merit-based systems that had taken shape during his earlier years. Even as his term neared its end, he resisted efforts to weaken these reforms, acting with the same quiet firmness that had characterized his entire public career. He regarded such measures as essential to preserving the trust of citizens in the fairness of their government. In foreign affairs, and Cleveland continued to practice restraint. Diplomatic matters, negotiations, and treaty discussions remained part of the daily work of the administration, yet he approached each with a calm understanding that stability formed the foundation of effective international relations. His communications with foreign representatives were thoughtful and measured, emphasizing mutual respect and the importance of resolving questions through deliberation rather than confrontation. These habits, consistent across both administrations, had contributed to a foreign policy marked by continuity and prudence. Personal reflections became a more frequent part of his routine during these months, though they did not take the form of public statements. And Cleveland understood that his long career in public office had shaped not only the institutions he served, but also his own habits of thought. He reflected on the responsibilities he'd carried and the principles that had guided him, principles instilled in childhood, reinforced through legal practice, and tested repeatedly in public service. These reflections did not lead him towards self-congratulation or regret. Instead, they reinforced his belief that steady, principled conduct mattered most in shaping the long-term health of a nation. The rhythms of daily life in the White House continued with quiet regularity. Cleveland maintained his preference for simplicity, avoiding elaborate ceremonies and focusing instead on the administrative work that required his attention. Meetings with advisors, correspondents, and officials filled his schedule, yet he approached each with the calm patience that had come to define his leadership. Observers often remarked on the stillness of his demeanour, a quality that remained unaltered even under the pressures of national responsibility. As the time for transition approached, Cleveland prepared formal messages summarising the state of the nation. These writings displayed the same clarity and measured tone that had characterised all his communications. He outlined the progress made, acknowledged ongoing challenges, and emphasised the importance of continued stewardship. His intent was not to shape the work of his successor, but to offer a clear record of the condition in which he left the office. He believed that such transparency formed an essential part of responsible leadership. In public responses to his final months varied. Some citizens continued to admire his steadfastness and his refusal to yield to pressures that conflicted with his principles. Others, fatigued by the economic difficulties of the decade, viewed his policies with mixed feelings. Cleveland accepted these perspectives without defensiveness. He believed that the strength of a democratic nation rested in its varied opinions, and that the ultimate measure of leadership lay not in universal approval, but in fidelity to principle. As his term drew to a close, Cleveland prepared to leave the capital quietly. He made arrangements for his departure with minimal ceremony, reflecting his lifelong preference for modest transitions. His family prepared to return to civilian life, anticipating the calm routines that awaited them beyond the public sphere. Cleveland himself looked forward to the quieter patterns of private life, though he remained mindful of the responsibilities he had carried and the trust he'd been given. On his final day in office, he conducted his duties with the same deliberate attention that had guided his first. He reviewed lingering documents, met briefly with staff, and ensured that the process of transition would proceed smoothly. His departure from the White House had none of the sentiment or formality that often accompanies such moments. Instead, it reflected the values that had shaped his entire career: modesty, clarity, and an unwavering respect for the structure of public service. The closing of Grover Cleveland's public career was not marked by dramatic gestures or declarations. It unfolded quietly, lie in harmony with the rhythm of a life dedicated to disciplined responsibility. As he left office, he did so with a sense of continuity rather than conclusion. The principles he had upheld, restraint, fairness, and deliberate judgment, remained a steady presence within him, ready to shape the next chapter of his life as he transitioned from the responsibilities of a national leadership to the calm routines of private life. When Grover Cleveland left the White House at the close of his second presidency, he stepped quietly into a new phase of life, one marked by stillness, reflection, and an unhurried rhythm far removed from the pressures of national decision-making. He and his family settled in the serene community of Princeton, where tree-lined streets, gentle landscapes, eager soar, and the steady routines of a university town formed a calm backdrop to his later years. After decades of public responsibility, Cleveland found in Princeton a setting that allowed him to live with measured privacy while remaining intellectually engaged with the world around him. The transition to this quieter life unfolded with the same steadiness that had guided every earlier change in his career. Cleveland, accustomed to long hours of reading official reports and reviewing legislative materials, adapted naturally to a routine that centered on quieter forms of study. His home in Princeton became a place of daily reflection. Mornings began with simple household routines, followed by hours spent reading newspapers, legal texts, and works of history. He continued to follow national developments, not with the immediacy of one responsible for responding to them, but with the thoughtful interest of a man who had devoted many years to shaping public institutions. Though he had stepped away from public office, Cleveland remained a figure of national interest. Visitors occasionally made their way to his residence to seek his perspective on political matters or to express gratitude for his years of service. He received such guests with his characteristic composure, welcoming yet measured, attentive yet free from any desire to influence events. His comments on current affairs were often simple observations, shaped by a lifetime of careful judgment. He did not seek to guide policy from afar, nor did he cultivate a role as an elder statesman. Instead, he maintained a modest distance, or offering clarity when asked, but avoiding any sense of public intervention. Cleveland's life in Princeton also offered space for deeper involvement in community matters. He accepted opportunities to participate in university-related activities, recognizing the value of education in shaping thoughtful citizens. He occasionally spoke at gatherings or served in advisory roles, approaching each engagement with the same deliberate manner he had always brought to public responsibilities. His presence carried a quiet dignity that resonated with students, faculty, and townspeople alike. They admired not only his public record, but also the calm steadiness that defined his personal conduct. Family life during these years grew into a central source of contentment. Cleveland's home became a place of gentle conversation, shared meals, and unhurried evenings. His children, still young at the time of his retirement, filled the house with a life and movement that contrasted softly with the calmness of their father's demeanour. Cleveland cherished these moments, perhaps more deeply because the duties of office had limited such time in earlier years. He found satisfaction in the routines of family life, the simple rhythms of watching his children grow, listening to their stories, and offering guidance shaped by quiet wisdom rather than authority. Even in retirement, Cleveland maintained strict personal habits. His days were orderly, marked by reading, correspondence, and walks through the peaceful streets of Princeton. He continued to write with steady clarity, responding to letters from friends, acquaintances, and citizens who sought his views on legal questions or public policy. Though he answered selectively, each response reflected the thoughtful precision that had marked his official communications. His letters, calm and measured, revealed the same respect for principled reasoning that had defined his time in office. In Princeton, he also found opportunities for reflection that public life had not permitted. He reviewed the events of his career not as a sequence of triumphs or difficulties, but as a long continuity of responsibility. He believed that he had acted according to the principles he held, even when those principles had brought criticism. His reflections did not dwell on political disputes or personal challenges. Instead, they focused on the enduring value of disciplined service, a theme that had shaped his life from his earliest days in the small towns of New York and New Jersey. Cleveland also maintained an interest in the welfare of the Democratic Party and the nation as a whole, though he remained careful not to impose his views on active political leaders. When asked for advice, he responded with clarity, emphasizing moderation, fairness, and adherence to principle. His counsel reflected a quiet belief that the long-term health of the nation depended on steady governance rather than rapid or dramatic change. The peaceful environment of Princeton allowed Cleveland to cultivate a sense of balance in his later years. He continued to read widely, often selecting works that explored the evolution of nations, the structure of public institutions, and the quiet responsibilities of citizenship. These readings provided him with a sense of connection to the broader world, even as his personal life unfolded at a gentle pace. Occasionally he accepted invitations to speak or write, offering reflections on law or public duty. His tone remained consistent, calm, unhurried, and grounded in long experience. He did not seek influence through these contributions, but rather aimed to clarify ideas that he believed essential for future generations. His words carried weight not because of their force, but because of the steady life behind them. In Princeton, Cleveland found the peace that had eluded him during years of public service. His days were filled with quiet movements, the turning of book pages, the slow walk along familiar streets, the thoughtful pause before responding to a letter. These moments, though simple, reflected the culmination of a life lived with consistency and restraint. As time passed, Cleveland's health began to undergo gradual changes, as is common with advancing age. Yet he continued to face each day with the same quiet resolve that had shaped his entire life. He accepted these changes without complaint, recognizing them as part of the natural progression toward the final chapters of a long journey. In these peaceful years in Princeton, Grover Cleveland lived with a sense of settled calm. The responsibilities of high office lay behind him, but the principles that had guided him remained deeply embedded in his daily life. His presence in the community served as a gentle reminder of the quiet strength that arises from discipline, integrity, and the steady fulfillment of duty. In the years following his retirement to Princeton, Grover Cleveland settled into a rhythm of life that allowed for quiet contemplation and steady intellectual engagement. Though removed from the responsibilities of office, he remained attentive to the unfolding events of the nation, observing them with the careful, deliberate perspective that had shaped every stage of his public career. His home became a place where thought matured slowly, carried forward by daily routines that encouraged reflection rather than ambition. In this environment, Cleveland's post-presidential years unfolded with the same sense of measured purpose that had defined his earlier life. A significant portion of his time was devoted to correspondence. Letters arrived from across the country, some from old colleagues, others from young citizens seeking guidance, yes, and still others from individuals who wrote simply to express respect. Cleveland approached each letter with a characteristic sense of duty. Although he could not answer everyone, he studied them with care, recognizing in each writer a person engaged with the questions of public life. His replies carried the quiet clarity that had defined his official communications. He did not offer sweeping pronouncements or political directives. Instead, he wrote with modest precision, offering reflections grounded in principle rather than persuasion. These letters revealed the enduring seriousness with which he approached public affairs. Even in retirement, he felt a responsibility to articulate ideas thoughtfully. He continued to emphasize the value of restraint, the importance of fiscal responsibility, and the necessity of maintaining trust in governmental institutions. Those who received his letters often described them as calm and firm, written by a man who had remained faithful to the disciplined habits of his youth. Cleveland believed that ideas should be expressed with care, and he applied that belief consistently throughout his correspondence. He also continued to write for publication on occasion. These essays and statements, while infrequent, reflected his continued interest in matters of public concern. They often arose in response to questions about constitutional issues, the role of government, or the responsibilities of citizenship. Cleveland approached each topic with quiet seriousness. His writing displayed the same measured pace and careful reasoning that had characterized his presidential messages. These pieces did not seek to influence political outcomes. Instead, they offered a calm perspective shaped by experience and guided by principle. Cleveland's days in Princeton also afforded time for reflection on the broader arc of his life. He considered the long progression from his childhood in modest parsonages, through years of legal apprenticeships, to the responsibilities he had carried in city, state, and national offices. His reflections did not dwell on moments of hardship or triumph. Rather, they focused on the enduring values that had guided him: clarity of thought, consistency in judgment, and a steadfast belief that public responsibility required restraint. His sense of fulfillment came not from the offices he had held, but from the knowledge that he had acted according to the principles he believed essential to the functioning of a healthy democracy. Visitors who met Cleveland during these years often remarked on the quiet dignity of his presence. He spoke slowly, thought carefully before responding, and listened with genuine attention. His manner conveyed respect without ceremony, reflecting a lifetime of disciplined conduct. While he welcomed conversation, he did not seek to dominate discussions or offer unsolicited advice. Instead, he expressed his views when asked, sharing insights shaped by decades of thoughtful public service. In these moments, he remained the same steady figure who had once guided the nation with quiet determination. Yet Cleveland maintained an interest in the evolving landscape of American politics, though he observed from a respectful distance. He followed newspapers and journals with regularity, reading about legislative developments, economic trends, and civic movements. He did not express strong reactions to every shift or debate. Rather, he considered each development with an understanding of the complexities involved. His reflections on these issues were often shared only within the privacy of letters or quiet conversations. He believed that the responsibility for guiding the nation belonged to those currently in office, and he refrained from assuming a public role in shaping their decisions. Though his life was largely private, Cleveland also accepted opportunities to serve in roles that reflected his enduring dedication to public welfare. He participated in committees, spoke at select gatherings, and offered guidance when invited to contribute to discussions about governance or education. These activities allowed him to remain engaged with the world while preserving the quiet rhythm of retirement. His involvement always reflected the same principles: careful thought, modest expression, and a belief in the value of steady, disciplined effort. Family life provided Cleveland with a sense of grounded peace. His home in Princeton was a place of gentle domestic activity, where he observed his children's growth with quiet pride and offered guidance shaped by long experience. Their presence softened the edges of his days, reminding him of the continuity of life beyond the responsibilities of office. He valued the regularity of shared meals, the sound of youthful conversation, and the comfort of familiar routines. These moments allowed him to experience a dimension of life that public service had often placed beyond reach. Cleveland also found solace in the natural environment around Princeton. He enjoyed unhurried walks along peaceful streets and through gently rolling landscapes. These excursions allowed him to consider his thoughts without distraction, providing a sense of continuity with the quietness he had carried throughout his life. The steady rhythm of walking aligned well with his methodical temperament, offering a daily practice that complemented his intellectual reflections. As the years progressed, Cleveland remained a figure of quiet respect. Citizens continued to view him as a model of principled leadership, and though he did not seek such recognition, he accepted it with humility. His life in Princeton reflected the culmination of a career defined by careful judgment and calm public service. The quiet persistence that had carried him through challenges of national importance now guided him through the gentler responsibilities of private life. In these reserved years, Cleveland demonstrated that the qualities he valued, moderation, clarity, and integrity, could shape a life long after public office had ended. His reflections, correspondence, and measured engagements with the world offered a final demonstration of the character that had defined him from the beginning, a steady devotion to principle, expressed without haste and without need for acclaim. As Grover Cleveland advanced further into his later years in Princeton, the quiet routines that had shaped his retirement continued to provide structure and calm. Yet time's gradual progression brought with it the physical limitations that accompany advancing age. Though Cleveland met these changes with the same steadiness that had characterized his entire life, those closest to him observed the unhurried but persistent softening of his strength. His days remained centered around reading, reflection, correspondence, and gentle walks, but each activity became more measured, shaped by the natural slowing of the body. For many years following his departure from public office, Cleveland's health had remained generally stable. He maintained a disciplined lifestyle, avoided excess, and relied on the calm rhythms of Princeton to preserve his well-being. But as the new century unfolded, small signs of fatigue began to appear. He tired more easily after reading for long periods, accepted fewer invitations to speak, and shortened the distance of his daily walks. These changes did not trouble him deeply. He recognized them as part of life's natural cycle and continued to move through his days with quiet composure. Cleveland remained intellectually engaged even as his physical energy waned. He continued to read widely on topics of law, economics, and history, keeping a thoughtful eye on the country's evolving political climate. His correspondence, though less voluminous, retained the clarity and restraint for which he had long been known. He responded only when he felt able, choosing his words with the same deliberate care that had shaped his official messages. Even as he wrote less frequently, those who received his letters felt the presence of a steady mind, thoughtful and unhurried. In the final years of his life, Cleveland's health underwent more notable decline. His physicians monitored him carefully, noting fluctuations that suggested weakening circulation and a gradual strain upon the heart. Cleveland faced these developments with calm acceptance. His temperament, formed early in life and reinforced through decades of disciplined service, inclined him toward quiet endurance. He did not express fear or impatience. Instead, he acknowledged the approach of life's final chapter with the same measured thoughtfulness that had accompanied all earlier transitions. During this period, he spent increasing amounts of time at home, surrounded by the quiet domestic rhythms that had come to define his retirement. Family members offered gentle companionship, providing support without pressing upon him the sense of infirmity. Cleveland listened to their conversations, joined when able, and often rested in the stillness of his study, where books lined the walls and familiar papers rested neatly on his desk. These surroundings, reflective of a lifetime shaped by reading and careful thought, offered comfort in the face of diminishing strength. As his health weakened further, Cleveland's world grew smaller, centered almost entirely within the rooms of his Princeton home. Physicians visited regularly, noting each shift in his condition with professional concern. Family members observed gradual changes in his breathing, his energy, and the quiet pauses that punctuated his conversations. Yet even as his strength waned, Cleveland maintained a composed demeanor. He accepted assistance with gratitude, spoke with calm clarity when he could, and faced each day with an unspoken understanding that his life was nearing its natural close. In the early summer of 1908, his condition grew more serious. Physicians recognized that he was entering the final stage of his illness, marked by a gentle but irreversible decline in the function of his heart. Cleveland himself understood this and remained peaceful, expressing no alarm. His mind remained clear, and those who spent time with him sensed that he approached the end with the same steady conviction that had guided him during years of public duty. He did not speak in dramatic terms or offer sweeping reflections. Instead, he met the final days with quiet acceptance. On a calm June morning, Grover Cleveland passed away in his Princeton home. His death came gently, the culmination of a slow decline rather than a sudden event, and surrounding him were the familiar spaces that had provided comfort throughout his later years, a setting far removed from the ceremonial chambers of government. The stillness that settled over the house reflected the quietness of his entire life's approach to transition. Unhurried, composed, and without unnecessary display. News of his passing spread quickly across the nation. Newspapers from the East Coast to the expanding towns of the West published tributes that reflected the wide respect he had earned. Writers recalled his integrity, his deliberate manner, and the clarity of his judgment during times of national strain. Many emphasized his steadfast commitment to principle, noting that he had twice accepted the burdens of the presidency, not out of ambition but out of a sense of duty. His leadership during periods of economic uncertainty was remembered with particular appreciation, recognized as a model of composed governance in difficult times. Public response to his passing was characterized by quiet respect rather than heightened emotion. Citizens reflected on his long life, recalling his beginnings in modest circumstances, his rise through local offices in Buffalo, and his years of service at the state and national levels. Commentaries highlighted the consistency of his character, noting that he had remained the same steady, principled figure, whether serving as a county official or guiding the nation. His refusal to compromise on matters of fiscal restraint and administrative integrity was recalled as evidence of a rare steadiness. Memorial services were held in Princeton and elsewhere, marked by dignified simplicity. Those who attended spoke of Cleveland's devotion to responsibility, his measured temperament, and the calm strength he brought to the presidency. Observers also noted the peacefulness of his final years, recognizing that the quiet rhythms of Princeton had offered him a fitting environment in which to conclude a life defined by quiet perseverance. In the weeks that followed, newspapers and journals published reflections on his legacy. Writers described him as a man who embodied the virtues of steadiness, clarity, and responsibility, qualities sometimes overshadowed by more dramatic expressions of leadership, but no less essential to the well-being of a nation. His name became associated with the idea of governance grounded in principle rather than personal ambition, a reminder of the quiet strength that can shape public life through thoughtful, consistent effort. Thus, Cleveland's final chapter closed as his life had unfolded, with calmness, dignity, and a quiet devotion to principle. His passing marked the end of a long journey that had carried him from modest family beginnings through decades of public duty, and finally into the peaceful rest of private reflection. The nation he had served remembered him not for flamboyant gestures or stirring rhetoric, but for the steady presence he offered during moments of uncertainty, a presence rooted in discipline, clarity, and enduring integrity. In the months and years following Grover Cleveland's passing in Princeton, a gradual process of reflection began to shape the earliest contours of his historical legacy. As communities across the country resumed the steady rhythms of daily life, scholars, editors, and private citizens alike took time to consider the long arc of his public service. Their reflections emerged not from sudden reassessments, but from the careful accumulation of memories formed during decades in which Cleveland had guided public institutions with restraint, clarity, and measured judgment. From these recollections, an understanding of his place in American history began to take form. Observers noted first the consistency of his character. Unlike many public figures whose legacies are shaped by dramatic moments or shifting popular sentiment, Cleveland's reputation rested upon a steadfast devotion to principle. From his early years in Buffalo through his time as governor of New York and his 2 non-consecutive terms in the White House, he demonstrated an unwavering commitment to clarity in fiscal matters and fairness in administration. Commentators, writing in the calm tone of retrospective analysis, frequently observed that Cleveland approached each responsibility with the same careful deliberation, regardless of its scale. This steadiness became one of the defining markers of his legacy. In these early assessments, scholars emphasized his unusual distinction as the only American president to serve 2 non-consecutive terms. This fact alone set him apart in the narrative of national leadership, yet his legacy did not depend solely on this distinction. Rather, it served as a structural reminder of the trust placed in him by citizens at two distinct moments in national life. His return to office in 1892 after a period of quiet private living became a symbol of continuity in public confidence. Historians later noted that such renewed trust reflected not charisma or political manoeuvring, but a recognition of Cleveland's principled steadiness, qualities that had remained visible even during his retreat from public affairs. Cleveland's leadership during economic turmoil also featured prominently in early historical reflections. The Panic of 1893 and the difficult years that followed had demanded careful judgment and firm adherence to principle. Though these years were marked by hardship, and Cleveland's responses, centered on fiscal discipline and long-term stability, were viewed by many early historians as evidence of his grounded approach, these scholars noted that he had chosen policies not for short-term popularity, but for what he believed served the underlying strength of the nation. This quiet determination became a central part of how early commentators assessed his presidency. His dedication to civil service reform likewise shaped the early interpretation of his legacy. At a time when political patronage still exerted powerful influence, Cleveland's insistence on merit-based appointment represented a steady effort to strengthen the foundations of government. Early evaluations highlighted this commitment, as recognizing that his support for administrative professionalism contributed to the gradual evolution of federal institutions. Though the impact of these reforms unfolded slowly, scholars noted that Cleveland's consistent advocacy formed an important step in the broader development of American governance. The tone of early memorial writings reflected the calmness of Cleveland's own disposition. Authors described him as a leader who neither sought acclaim nor governed through displays of forceful personality. Instead, they emphasized his preference for quiet reason, clear explanation, and the deliberate pace of careful thought. Obituaries and commemorative essays often remarked on the stillness of his manner, an attribute that had become part of his public identity. In the years immediately following his death, this demeanour was viewed as a model of principled leadership, particularly appealing during periods when political life appeared increasingly turbulent. In Princeton, where he had lived his final years, residents remembered him as a neighbour whose quiet presence enriched the community. Local reflections often drew upon the image of Cleveland walking slowly through the tree-lined streets, offering a courteous greeting, or pausing to speak thoughtfully with acquaintances. These memories contributed to a legacy grounded not only in national achievements, but also in the steady humanity with which he approached daily life. Such recollections reinforced the idea that Cleveland's character was consistent across private and public spheres, a feature that shaped early assessments of his historical significance. These academic institutions began to examine his life with greater attention as well. Scholars noted that Cleveland's policies reflected a firm belief in limited governmental expenditure and a disciplined approach to national finances. While later generations would debate the long-term effects of these positions, early commentators viewed them as evidence of a leader determined to preserve stability during a time of rapid economic and social change. His measured reasoning, often visible in the carefully written veto messages and annual addresses, offered scholars a rich source for understanding the administrative philosophy of the late 19th century. In discussions of his legacy, many writers highlighted Cleveland's independence. He stood apart from strong partisan pressures, and often choosing courses of action that reflected personal conviction rather than party alignment. This independence, sometimes a source of political tension during his life, became a hallmark of his early historical memory. Observers saw in him a figure who exemplified the ideal of public service rooted in principle rather than conformity. Such reflections further shaped the narrative of Cleveland as a president who brought disciplined objectivity to the responsibilities of his office. During the early formation of his legacy, Cleveland's life story also became a touchstone for discussions about the nature of leadership. Writers noted that he had risen from modest beginnings, guided by the influence of a disciplined household and shaped by years of thoughtful legal practice. His ascent through local and state offices, grounded in reliability rather than ambition, offered a model of gradual, principled development. These aspects of his life resonated with those who saw in Cleveland's career evidence that steady character could guide a person from humble origins to national responsibility. Public sentiment following his death contributed further to the early narrative of his legacy. Citizens wrote letters, shared recollections, and expressed quiet appreciation for the clarity he had brought to public office. Many remembered moments in which his decisions reflected deep thought, rather than haste, sometimes unpopular, yet grounded in what he believed to be essential principles. Over time, these reflections contributed to a growing understanding of Cleveland not as a figure defined by dramatic episodes, but as one whose influence arose from the consistent application of disciplined judgment. As years passed and early memories began to give way to more formal historical analysis, the foundational elements of Cleveland's legacy were already firmly in place: steadiness of character, devotion to responsibility, and quiet adherence to principle. These qualities, visible in the earliest reflections on his life, formed the basis upon which future generations would continue to explore his place in American history. His legacy, shaped first by those who knew him and who lived through the times he guided, rested not in spectacle, but in the enduring calm of thoughtful governance, a calm that echoed long after his passing.